I've been tasked to talk about the regulatory and kind of political environment on natural gas. So one of the issues is I'm on the wrong side of 50 as of a few months ago. And the older I get, the more I realize that if you take a rational, numbers, factual view of politics and regulatory elements, you're never going to get it right, because what's going on in Washington with energy policy has nothing to do with what's right and what's factual. So let me tell you a story. I see a number of you folks in here who may remember a world before we had a 24-hour news cycle. There are probably a couple of you. So think about CNN in 1990. That was the leading edge. In the first news story that went viral before going viral was actually a term. There were 3 gray whales stuck in the ice on the North Slope of Alaska. If anybody remembers that, it was 1990. Back when I did real work for a living, I was on the North Slope at the time. 3 gray whales got stuck in the ice, but they didn't migrate out fast enough. They called the head whale guy at U.S. Fish and Game down in Anchorage, and he said, no, go ahead and harvest them and take them. And they said, nah, because it turns out that gray whale is kind of on the scale, it's more like bologna and pimento loaf than, say, prime rib. And the Eskimos said, no, we don't really want to take them. So he got on his plane with his elephant gun and was going to shoot them. And when he landed on the North Slope, Nancy Reagan was on the phone because she had seen the story and said, gosh, could you please save the whales? And that started chaos. And there was a Russian icebreaker that came in. There were 3 helicopters with this big concrete thing that were punching holes in the ice to keep the air hole alive. Well, the icebreaker came in from Russia, and all the biologists are saying, gosh, we wish they'd die and their DNA would leave the gene pool. Arco Alaska spent $500,000 on fuel for the National Guard helicopters. $500,000 in fuel alone. And in the middle of this, the environmentalists had a massive debate. Huge problem, because they made everybody stand down because they're trying to save the whales, but there were polar bears sighted a couple miles away. Well, polar bear will jump in and drag one of the baby gray whales out, and that's his food. So now you have the debate. Do you save the whale because it's popular and it's on TV, or do you let Mother Nature take its course? And that was a huge dilemma for the environmentalists in this topic. And this is important because we had one of those issues just in the last week. The New York Times has been the champion for anti-fracturing. They have been the absolute source of misinformation on hydraulic fracturing and keeping part of this anti-fracturing debate alive in the public domain. In fact, the New York Times ombudsman censured a couple New York Times reporters. The reporting was so bad and so factually incorrect. So it was so bad even the New York Times realized they made a mistake. But yet, what did they talk about earlier this week or late last week? I guess late last week was the U.S. should use LNG exports as a strong arm in foreign in kind of foreign politics and foreign affairs as it relates to this Ukrainian-Russian thing. Because if the Russians stop pipeline gas through the Ukraine, Western Europe doesn't have gas. And by the way, I've been in London in January, and London without natural gas would be a non-starter. So the point is, the New York Times says, well, we have all this natural gas. We'll just use that as kind of the leading edge for our foreign policy now, and we'll use gas exports as a way to project power globally. Well, how in the world are you going to project power globally if you don't fracture gas wells? You aren't going to have any gas to export. How is that going to work? So so one of the things we've gotten right on the public policy front is allowing natural gas exports, right? That's helping. Now, if you want to take that to the natural conclusion, you better be in favor of hydraulic fracturing. I'm going to show you a couple slides here, because without fracturing, we don't have gas to export. So I'm going to bring you up to speed a little bit on the natural gas market. This is gas, working gas in inventory. The red line is where we are today. We're almost at 10-year lows because we have indeed had a cold winter. although we've had to cover our plants a couple times in Houston. Folks in Chicago would argue it was a lot worse up there, and we're happy that they're cold in Chicago. Here's the issue. This is onshore production growth. And really, this is from 2005 to present. So this is the last kind of 8 or 9 years of production growth. And there were a number of folks out there, I call them the shale deniers. They said, oh, it can't work, it can't do this, you can't do that. And I actually think folks in the industry didn't think, even in 2007 and 8, when it was clear onshore gas production was growing, there were a number of folks who just didn't believe that it was sustainable. And it's, what's interesting about this is onshore production growth in a time frame when actual gas-directed rig count's been declining, right? Because the individual wells are more impactful. It's about the Marcellus and the Utica being very, very prolific and productive. This is all you need to know about the ability of the U.S. to use LNG exports to project for foreign policy. Now, we can't export LNG yet, but we will be able to. The red dotted line is what we would call all other basins except for the Marcellus, Utica, and Eagle Ford. So the all other basin decline has the Barnett Shale, the Haynesville Shale, and the Fayetteville Shale, all three potentially prolific gas basins. Our view is in a $4.50 to $5 gas world, you probably don't need those basins to grow. So rig count's going to stay fairly soft there. But you have enough growth, we think, in the Marcellus, Utica, and Eagle Ford to see significant growth through the end of the decade. And LNG exports will start to come into this equation in 2017. And we think by 2020, there'll be 3.5 or so BCF a day of LNG exports. Now, if you listen to folks in 2005, we were supposed to be importing 10 BCF of LNG by today, right? So long-term gas forecasts in gas have proven to be problematic, but we think that there's lots of gas, and this doesn't count Western Canadian LNG exports, et cetera. So the point here is, the tagline of this slide is hydraulic fracturing saved the U.S. industrial sector, and I believe that because we have $4 natural gas. And if you're looking at gas in Tokyo, it's going to be $16, and gas in Europe is going to be $12, right? This is a big deal, and you're going to see massive amount of capital spent on the Gulf Coast in petrochemical and LNG and in refining, and you're going to spend it on the Gulf Coast because, well, the Kennedys don't want a refinery in Nantucket, but we're going to see a lot of that, and you're seeing Houston, and you're going to see a lot of that capital spent is going to come through Houston for those projects to happen. So this is really a good thing. And if you think about what manufacturing sectors are levered to gas, also think about electricity, because cheap gas prices make electricity prices low. So it's chemicals, it's steel, it's glass, it's paper. I mean, there's any number of industries that benefit significantly from low gas and power prices. So, gas is pretty easy. The challenge is when you kind of get to crude, and there's a couple things I want you to take away from this. You'll hear people say, so this is a graph of OECD inventories. So this is crude oil plus all refined products. This is developed Asia, it's North America, and I used to call it developed Europe, but let's just call it Western Europe for this conversation. And this is 2.6 billion barrels of stuff, so there's a lot of things we're counting every month. And again, it's crude plus refined products. And if you listen to guys like me on TV over the last year and a half, you'd be convinced that the world's 1.5 million barrels a day oversupplied and that crude's going to 60. Well, let's look at inventories. That's the best metric we've got. And inventories are actually near 10-year lows. And we have inventories through the end of December. We'll get January inventories this Friday. The market's not 1.5 million barrels a day oversupplied. The market's arguably balanced or actually slightly tight. And you get a guy like me on TV, and Maria Bartiromo will ask the question, well, if the world's 1.5 million barrels a day oversupplied, because there's still guys who believe that, then why is Brent $110 a barrel? And that guy will say, well, that's easy. Risk premium, right? Well, so here's a fun fact. I do this for a living. When you get on TV and you use risk premium, that is the last answer right above, I have no idea. All right? And it just sounds better. So risk premium, so risk, look, the world's been, I've been doing this since 1998, and there's always been bad stuff going on in the world. There are things going on, but unless you think we're all going to hold hands and sing We Are the World, Brent's going to be $110 a barrel because the world's tight, right? The global market's tight, and that's something to take. And that's what's so interesting about this is this is a graph. The gray bars are non-OPEC supply on the right axis. The blue bars are U.S. oil production that goes on the left axis. What's interesting, we're in a $110 world. Outside of the U.S., there is no oil production growth. Right? What's going on in the U.S. is miraculous. Right? It is unbelievable for anybody to think 5 years ago that the U.S. would be the only place in the non-OPEC world, particularly onshore, where oil production is growing. And this is what's happening. So I'm going to wrap this up in a second, but the issue here is, if you went back and listened to the peak oil guys a few years ago, the argument was, you can't grow production, but even if you can, it's heavy sour crude, and we don't have refining capacity for the heavy sour crude. I don't know if you remember that argument, but the late Matt Simmons kind of pushed that argument. Well, what's interesting here is we've gone from 3 million barrels a day to over 6 million barrels a day of onshore production. All 3 million barrels a day of that growth is light sweet crude. Right? So because you can't produce low quality oil out of low quality rock, but you can produce high quality oil out of low quality rock. So now we've got a problem. What are we going to do with all this crude? Because we can't export it, right? So we're going to refine it, and we're exporting refined products. The challenge is sometime this year, and we think we're awfully close, we're pushing out all of the light sweet imports. And so by the end of this year, we're going to have too much light sweet production coming into the U.S. via internal production. We're not going to have the ability to refine all of it, and that's going to create some pricing pressure on light sweet crude. And we can export LNG, we can export refined products, we can split condensate and export it, but we can't export crude oil per federal regulation, right? We're not going to be able to export crude until after 2016, and then it's going to be a function of what the political landscape looks like. Now, what's interesting, I'm going to show you just the graph on the last. This is my last slide. All right, so think about this. This is also kind of are we going to save the whales or let the polar bears have dinner? The administration clearly doesn't like big oil. Well, big oil is short crude. So what's going to happen here is we think over time, if Brent's $100 a barrel, West Texas Intermediate in Oklahoma will be 87. And so if you think about this, Brent and WTI are kind of like Pepsi and Coke. They're the same thing, but they're going to be priced $13 a barrel different because we have too much light sweet crude in the U.S. And you're going to have to reduce the inland price to incent refiners to refine it. But the refiners are putting gasoline on the global market. So who's going to win in all this? It's going to be the U.S. refiners there are independent refiners, but you also have Shell, BP, Exxon. Those refiners are short crude. So if you don't allow crude exports, who wins? It's the refiners. So big oil wins. And the guys who made all this happen, the Bakken producers, the West Texas producers, the Eagle Ford producers, so this is Continental, Oasis, EOG, it's independent oil and gas guys. They're the ones who get hurt by the inability to export crude oil, and big oil wins, right? And I think cool heads will prevail over time, and we will be able to export crude, but it's going to be a painful couple years in our view as oil production is going to continue to march higher, and we're going to be flooded with light sweet crude on the Gulf Coast. So from a public policy perspective, I think the ability or inability to export crude oil is probably the thing we're the most focused on over the next 2 or 3 years, because it is going to create a number of winners and losers depending on how that policy goes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tom.